All right. So hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm Kalyan, co-founder and CEO of Alumni. And like I was saying, I'm really excited to have so many of you tune in today. Um, Very quickly, for those of you that haven't heard of us, Alumnibase is an industry-leading alumni management software. Institutions typically use Alumnibase to improve their alumni engagement, find more alumni data, or grow alumni donations, right? My co-panelist and friend, Jay Dillon, I don't think he really needs an introduction, but for those of you who haven't heard of him before, he's the executive director of alumni relations at University of California, Berkeley. He has 17 years of leadership experience in higher education and advancement. Thanks again for joining me on this conversation, Jay.
It's my pleasure, Kalyan. It was just a year ago that I joined UC Berkeley as its executive director of alumni relations, and at that time, I rolled off the advisory board at Alumnibase. And I'm really excited to be back in conversation with you, and I've missed the opportunity to kind of talk about all things alumni engagement and tech. So I'm looking forward to that. And folks, here I'm going to change my name on the Zoom to include my mobile number. That's my WhatsApp as well, and I'm also going to put that into the chat. I would really enjoy connecting with you, whether it's by a phone call, a text, WhatsApp message, or messaging me on LinkedIn. I feel like this is the time where our alumni engagement community shines at moments like these where we are trying to create community across the world. So let's be in touch. And Kalyan, thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how approachable you've always been, and it's a good touch sharing your mobile number on your Zoom window. That's nice. And like Jay was mentioning, Jay and I have known each other for over 3 years now. And we've had plenty of passionate conversations about the future of alumni relations, especially this year. So much has changed. So the way we sort of put together this webinar is we thought it'll be nice for us to discuss what we both are seeing from different vantage points. Me me from an Alumni-based point of view, and Jay from his position at Berkeley, and then sort of share that conversation with everyone, right? So my hope really is that each of you will take back some very actionable learnings for this year from this conversation, for next year, actually. And I'm sure most of you have attended Zoom webinars by now, but just really quickly for those of you that haven't, I'm going to quickly run through the logistics of how this will work. All of you as attendees are muted by default. Only panelists, the three of us, are unmuted. Feel free to ask questions anytime during the webinar. You don't have to hold them till the end. And to ask a question, just type it into chat. There's a couple of different chats here. There's a Q&A window and there's a chat window. Feel free to type your question on either of those, right? Once we receive a question, we'll either read it out so that everybody knows what the question is before we answer it, or we are able to unmute you if you want to, explain the question further, right? Whatever slides you're seeing on the screen right now, we'll share that slide deck and a recording of the session with everyone. So feel free to just sit back and relax and listen in, right? With that out of the way, in terms of logistics, let's actually dive in. I wanted to start by saying this. I mean, for me, 2020 was a monumental year for alumni relations because the amount of change that I've seen in terms of what we've had to adapt to, I would probably argue that 10 years of change happened in the last 10 months, right? In terms of how much we've had to adapt to in terms of our programming, right? And Jay, you've been in this space for 17 years, right? How would you describe 2020? Is there a word that comes to mind?
The word that comes to mind is resilience, and it's probably a word that applies across different aspects of our lives, not just our professional work as alumni engagement professionals. But personally, too, I think resilience has reared its head as something that we've all had to become more capable, more flexible, more nimble. But a core part of resilience, I think, is patience, too. And the most difficult part of the year for me has been how the different regional and national approaches to this pandemic, to the anti-Blackness and racism that has reared its head in the United States, how this has ebbed and flowed. It's just not been consistent, and it's hard to react to things when they're not coming at you consistently. So lockdown or opening up, protests or no protests. Maybe we would have events in a month, they're not. That has proven, I think, to be the most difficult part of the year for me. So that word is definitely resilience.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's an excellent way to put it. And, resilience is what we've seen across the board. I mean, with all the organizations that we've worked with as well, right? So that's been very inspiring. Because when the pandemic hit us, it seemed like a dead end, right? Like we felt like we have no idea what we're going to do across all of the organizations that we work with, right? But interestingly, everybody stayed agile and found new ways to do our jobs, right? Maybe even better ways, actually, right? I think the biggest shift that happened, this year is obviously that, events went from being in person to being virtual. A lot of fundraising events got canceled, and, all of those campaigns needed to find a virtual alternative. And, there was a lot of focus on being very, communicating the need for each of our fundraising campaigns. And we've observed with our data across the year that, like, the fundraising campaigns that focused on a very specific need performed better than those without a clear cause, right? So that was another interesting thing that we saw this year. I think one of the most interesting things that we saw was how many new alumni started engaging, alumni that were traditionally not engaged with these institutions. Because whether your alum is in San Francisco or Shanghai or Sydney, they now had a way to participate, right? And that's what I think virtual enabled this year. So that was an interesting data point for us to look at Alma Base. And the couple of other things that we also observed this year was social media engagement, has always been important, but I think it became more critical this year. And, we've observed across the board again that a lot of alumni relations teams started prioritizing that more this year compared to previous years, right? I also saw a lot of very new, programs being created to provide value to alumni. I'll share a few of those examples later in the webinar, but to me, what that showed was how creative we all are once the traditional constraints were removed, right? So those are some key observations from this year that I wanted to share. Jay, what have been the key takeaways for you this year?
I think these are probably the five, Kalyan. You've got them nicely represented here. There's been a shift in almost every aspect of our operations, but I think the most encouraging part of what we've experienced in these last 8 or 9 months here in the US is just being able to engage alumni not based on region. So much of our alumni engagement programs, events, even fundraising is designed around a particular area of concentration of our alumni. And I would argue that's probably not a winning strategy in this environment. And some schools have adapted to that very well, and I think others are just waiting to go back to normal. I think the latter is probably something they should reconsider.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think that strategy is getting a little bit more dated every few months now, right? And we're seeing very clear data to sort of show that, region-based programming is not necessarily the right direction to go. I want to actually share a story at this point. Actually, in a recent conversation between Jay and I, we started talking about this, so I wanted to include that here. So this CocaCola sign that you see on the screen is in San Francisco. Some of you may recognize it. So it was installed in 1937, right? So it's been there for 83 years now, right? That's a long time. None of us here were born for sure. My father was probably not born either. And it's being taken down this year, right? They've officially announced that they're going to be taking down this sign, and they're spending $100,000 to remove this sign, right? I can only imagine what it must cost to keep it, right? But why am I actually sharing this story, right? I think what's interesting for all of us to learn here is what's the reason they're actually removing it, right? And the official statement from Coca-Cola was that they're using that money and they're instead focusing on digital media platforms, right? Jay, I want to ask you a question at this point. How do you feel, being a San Francisco native, how do you feel about this sign being removed, and what does that tell you? What can we learn from it?
Well, the sign is iconic, and a lot of people here in the city are sad to see it go. But you mentioned it was built in 1937. It was erected at the time that the Bay Bridge was built. And you can see the bridge, beginning of the bridge right there to the left of the sign. So the reason Coca-Cola put it there, the reason that real estate is still so expensive for advertising, is because they were trying to capture people's attention, because so many people are traveling on that bridge. I'll tell you right now, as a San Francisco resident, ain't nobody traveling on the bridge anymore. You know, the traffic has reduced significantly in the city. Coca-Cola is not getting the attention that it had. And I think they're making the smart move and recognizing, you know, as fun as it might be to have this iconic sign, that ultimately their clients are elsewhere. And I think that's a lesson for us to take in alumni engagement as well. You know, where are we putting up billboards in our own alumni engagement programs and strategies, hoping that alumni will walk by, instead of trying to think about, as you see here on the screen, what should we be doing to take our content and deliver it to the places where our alumni are paying attention, and to do so consistently and to really hone in on that. So maybe time to get rid of the billboard as a metaphor for some of the things we do in our business. You know, the easiest thing to talk about is probably the print alumni directory as an example of something that really more of a paperweight than anything else.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And, you know, I think I'll second that, right? Like, I think the big shift that we're seeing is that, you know, successful alumni programs today are no longer just about putting together, let's say, the same events that you put together last year, right? It's not just about events, right? And I mean, I'll still say that that's a crucial part of a good alumni program, but that is by no means sufficient today, right? So I wanted to take another example to explain this shift, right? Like Jay was explaining, like say 30 years ago, just as a reference point, let's say Apple had to promote a watch, right? They would basically advertise on as many billboards as possible across America and hope that enough people, you know, will be there, see them and be interested in them, right? But today, when Apple wants to advertise that watch, right, you'll actually see that watch everywhere you go, right? If you're a potential buyer of that watch, right? Like you'll see that on your phone, inside an app, just before your YouTube video plays, on your computer, when you're browsing the internet. You know, your social media feed will start showing up the watch. On the TV, you'll start seeing the watch. So the point is that marketing has evolved, you know, brands have evolved their marketing so much that brands are present where their audience are, as opposed to saying, here's where we are and we expect you to come see us, right? And I think that's the most important lesson here, right? Like your alumni programs should be present where your alumni are, right? Because if you expect to improve alumni engagement by just organizing, let's say, in-person events, that's sort of my parallel to sort of saying, I'm just going to do billboard marketing in 2020, right? So this shift is not new, right? It's been happening for the past few years, but I think it's been significantly accelerated this year, just because of the inability for us to meet in person, right? And like Jay was saying, the best advancement shops are not just prepared for this, but are actually thriving with this shift, right? Jay, would you add anything there?
I think you nailed it, Kalyan. Change is a constant. I think we all know that. But I like what you said. Maybe we've had 10 years of change in 10 months. Feels that way.
Yeah, in so many aspects of life, but you know, this for sure. And I wanted to start with that because that shift is really important to understand as you're starting to think about, you know, alumni programming for 2021, right? You know, so we've started by talking about what we saw in 2020 at a high level and the big shift that's happened. Let's actually look ahead and talk about, you know, Jay and I have sort of consolidated it down to 4 recommendations and resolutions that we have for 2021. In my opinion, you know, 2021 is a very crucial year for alumni relations across the country, you know, because we've seen plenty of changes in 2020 and we've been adjusting and adapting very quickly. But I think 2021 is the year where either we decide to go back to sort of saying, hey, I'm going to do what I did earlier, hoping that, like, you know, all of our, we can go back to being able to meet in person, etc. You can either decide to go back to what you were doing, or you can really embrace that change, right? And really look at what's the best way to engage my alumni, right? So that's why I think this is a very crucial year. Jay, what about you? How are you thinking about 2021? Are you excited? What's top of mind for you?
Well, I think 2021 is a year where we as an industry finally decide to become alumni centric. I think our colleagues in fundraising and development have been talking about donor centricity for a really long time. And it started to get some traction as a strategy, and it has borne fruit as well. So I think this is the question for 2021. Are we alumni centric? And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, because your institution may talk about alumni centricity, but maybe in action, and it doesn't quite measure up.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of people during our conversations, when we talk about being alumni centric, everybody feels, yes, we are alumni centric, right? But when we get into the details is when we start really unpacking that, right? Are we truly alumni centric? Actually, Jay, let me ask you a question, right? Like, if you were to look at an alumni program or a university, how would you, are there some good ways to look at the programming and say, are you truly being alumni centric or not? Do you have any tactics or tips around that?
I've got a simple exercise that everyone here on the call, you can do it right now. So I invite you to go to your inbox and pull up last month's alumni e-newsletter, assuming that everybody has one, or maybe a recent all alumni communication. And get a piece of paper, put a line down the middle, and on the one side, write your school name, and on the other side, write the word alumni. And I want you to go through this communication top to bottom, and I want you to put a check mark on either side of those two columns. Anytime you run into your school name or the mascot or something associated with the school or its brand, the logo. And on the other side where it has the word alumni, I want you to put a check mark anytime the word alumni appears, or anytime the name of an alumnus, alumna, alumx appears, or anytime you're using the pronouns you or your. And on the university side, anytime you use the pronouns our, put a check mark there. So maybe it's a little bit too much to break off into to do right now, but it's an interesting exercise. You can do it with your team. But I think you might be surprised at how heavily the check marks are on the university side or the college side or the school name side. And just reflect on that for a moment. Here is what you probably regard as your signature, most important all alumni communication sent every month by email. And just kind of check yourself and say, are we really putting the alumni first in this communication in our language? And you may be surprised. So give that a shout, give that a try, and give me a shout if you find something interesting or if that little exercise doesn't make sense to you. But that's how I would measure alumni centricity, not by all the different things that you're doing and programs and outreach and stuff, but really at its very core, when you speak to alumni, what words do you use? What position do you take? And language is really important. And I think folks that work in consumer and retail brands probably understand that better than we do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love how simple that exercise is, and how you sort of consolidated down to the core, right? Because like you said, I mean, the person that's receiving the email, your alum in this case, needs to feel like this was written for him or her, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm just part of a communication that was sent to all alumni, right? Like that's what matters, right? And so I have this little picture here in terms of how I feel about alumni centricity, right? Typically what we've observed with most alumni programs is that you start with the university to try and understand what do you really want to be doing from an alumni engagement perspective. Then you look at the staff that you have available, and then you put together programs that are feasible, and then you send it out to all alumni, hoping that enough alumni will find interest in them, right? As opposed to being truly alumni centric, which is you start with the alumni, right? And you sort of say, what do my alumni really want from the institution, right? Like, what do they care about? How can I be helpful, right? And then you design services and experiences to facilitate that. And then all of your programs and all of your staff, like I said, are only facilitators for those experiences and services, right? For me, that's the way I would think about being alumni centric, right? And hopefully that picture, creates a better visual representation of what I mean by that, right? One of the examples I wanted to show you, which I really liked this year, was how Dartmouth, let me just pull this screen aside here. Dartmouth created a career network support challenge for the class of 2020. And this is being alumni centric because they've really thought about, for the class of 2020, what is important and how can we facilitate that, right? And so what they did is they said they created a challenge for all of their alumni to create 50 new work opportunities for the class of 2020. And they've created various ways to facilitate that, right? So they've created a board where opportunities can be posted. They created a LinkedIn group where people can share their expertise and connections with the younger alumni. They've asked people to spread the word on social media. So they've facilitated for this to happen. But I think what really caught my attention here was how crisply they were able to figure out what the alumni really want from that particular class, and then creating a service or a program that makes that happen, right? So that's what that was an interesting example that I wanted to make sure I shared. I mean, actually, let me just pause here for a second. Jay, would you add anything to that? Or, I want to ask you this, right? Like, what do you think gets people confused about being alumni centric? Why is it hard to make that distinction?
I think it's simple, really, Kalyan. It's the fact that each of us come to work every day and we think about the institution where we work. We care deeply about it. We interact with other staff, it's students and faculty. And so it's so hard to step out of our own head and consider for a moment that alumni are people too, and they are not waking up every morning thinking about their alma mater. So again, it's not something. I'm not trying to guilt trip anybody here, but just recognize that that's what we do. The analog to that in the retail space, there's probably a Nike content marketer who wakes up every morning and thinks that everybody should buy Nike's running shoes. But I don't think that they probably have that illusion by 9 or 10 o'clock when they get into the office. So let's just check ourselves a little bit. Our institutions are important. They were probably life-changing for the identities of many of our alumni. And whereas we may have a little bit of their heart share with them, they're certainly not waking up every day thinking about their alma mater the way we do.
Yeah, it's a very good observation. Yeah, so hopefully that was helpful, for everyone that's listening in. Let's dive into the second sort of core recommendation resolution that we have. So in alumni relations, we often talk about touch and feel, right? Like being able to meet in person. But I think it's important to realize that it doesn't have to be exclusively that, right? Like Jay, I know you and I have spoken about virtual engagement before, right? But I think it's never really taken center stage like it has this year, right? So how do you feel about virtual as a medium to engage alumni, right? Like what's the predominant emotion when you hear that word?
Well, when I see the word virtual, I actually think real. I think virtual is real engagement. And whereas maybe a year ago, Kalyan, you and I were trying to convince other people that that's true, I don't think we have to convince people now. One of the real positives, I think, of this virtual space has been our ability to have virtual board meetings. I know many of us probably deal with alumni boards and committees. They're an important part of what we do, but they also take up a lot of our time. And at least what we've seen here, and what I know from speaking with other colleagues at other colleges and universities, alumni boards or foundation boards, nonprofit boards that used to meet maybe 4 times a year for an extended period and get the catered lunch and have the gift for everybody at the table. Those have now become virtual meetings with higher levels of attendance that maybe occur every 6 weeks. And that's okay. And actually that's more helpful. We're always talking about the speed at which education moves, and particularly in our field and engagement and fundraising, being able to have these virtual, engagements, board meetings, committee meetings at a faster pace with greater participation is a good thing. And I really hope that stays. Maybe we have the once a year board retreat, but if I can leave my sport coat and my blue and gold tie in the closet a few more times a year for a virtual meeting, I'm going to be happy about that.
Yeah, that's one advantage of 2020, right? Like we're sitting in our sweatpants doing webinars. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty certain that virtual is here to stay, right? It's not really about picking virtual over in person. I think a winning strategy would be a hybrid one, because we saw the benefits of virtual events this year more than ever before, right? Like they're easier to organize, which means you can do more of them. You can experiment and test out different ideas faster with virtual programming, right? They're accessible to all of your alumni. Like I said, whether you're in San Francisco or Shanghai or Sydney, all of your alumni can access it now, which they didn't have access to before, because your local alumni and regional, I mean, wherever you had the chapters were more accessible, right? They're also very low cost compared to in-person events. And I think most importantly, there's no travel involved for anyone. So, it's just much easier for everyone on their schedules, right? I loved this one example that I wanted to share, which was from Harvard, right? They did this interesting sort of event where it's a virtual event where they've sort of asked people to join either based on their professional interest, for those that are interested in aerospace versus entrepreneurship, and also by cities, right? So each of these then breaks out into different virtual events, all happening on the same day. But the idea is to create connections, to create a network for all of their alumni, right? And so it starts virtual, right? It brings people together wherever they are. And then you can branch off into, maybe actually meeting in person later, right? And this is happening Jan 2021. But I thought this was really interesting as a hybrid way of looking at, how can you use virtual and in person? What's the best way to leverage that to improve alumni engagement, right? So that was an interesting example I wanted to share. So my recommendation here is that, even after we're able to meet in person again, continue to think about virtual, and it's a crucial part of your alumni engagement strategy, right? Jay, let me ask you a question. How would you incorporate virtual into the alumni strategy at Berkeley next year? I mean, I don't know how much of that you're able to share, but whatever you can, I think will be helpful for us.
So much of the virtual component, I think, depends on content. And perhaps one of the challenges that our alumni relation shops have faced this year is that we're often very lean. And also in times of economic constraint, engagement is maybe one of the first things on the chopping block. So one of the things I think that's challenging is to feel like you're creating good content to be shared virtually. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the session, but for me, it's really about consistency. So if you can, in your strategy for this coming calendar year, if you can articulate a strategy for virtual engagement, and then below that, tactics about how you're going to source the content, I think you're going to enter 2021 with breathing a sigh of relief. And so that means partnership with faculty and others who are producing content. It means partnership with the marketing arm of your institution, but even with student interns. Kalyan was talking about Dartmouth creating jobs for the class of 2020. Students are incredibly bright and smart people, and can easily provide bits of content in areas where you may not have expertise, and you should pay them. But it's also a wonderful experience for students to gain while they're in school. So I think, content is king. We've heard that before, but even more so in the virtual space, I think, just because there's so much of it.
And content is so critical in terms of the strategy. Making sure that you're constantly communicating and you're creating value through that content is super important. I mean, I do remember several of our customers creating educational webinars, for their alumni, which ended up being extremely successful, right? So that's a great example of that. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about this, think beyond events, right? Jay, do you remember you once told me how, people misunderstand alumni relations professionals as being equivalent to event organizers? And while we talk about events still being an important part of the alumni relations strategy, how should one think about alumni engagement strategy beyond events? What's a good way to get started there?
Well, I think that criticism of alumni engagement professionals as event planners is somewhat merited, simply because for the most part, engagement and content have been delivered predominantly through events. That's what our organizations have done. And the best example, a reunion, a homecoming, right? These are often our signature things, an awards ceremony or gala. So if you think about an event as being the signature thing that your engagement office produces, I think it's fair to wonder, well, what do you do other than events? And in this transition of bringing events online as well, what have we really changed about the format of the content delivery? Have we picked up the gala and tried to reproduce it online with the same smooth jazz music in the background? Or have we thought about it differently? So I think it's, events are here to stay as well. We said virtual is here to stay. Events are here to stay as well. But how are we going to use them? Does it make sense for us to put events as a primary strategy when it seems like the same content we might create for a single event on a specific day or time, virtual or in person? What if we could take that content and we could distribute it across various platforms and probably get more eyes on it? And again, I think that's the future that we're talking about here. Not to get rid of events or not to get rid of virtual, but to think about how the content we create is distributed across all the different delivery systems at our disposal. And we did have a quick question in the chat that I wanted to address about the sense of virtual fatigue from alumni. Sure, I'm seeing that at the very beginning of this pandemic. Our virtual events would have like a 70% show rate, which blew our mind. Now that's more like 50 or 55%. So that's gone down a little bit, I think, a measure of fatigue. But ultimately, there's always going to be that initial bump anytime there's a change. And so now we're just seeing what the staying power is. And I'm not worried about alumni, being too zoomed out that they won't find value in virtual content going forward. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think there's a fatigue around virtual events specifically, especially if you're like creating an event where alumni, maybe like the event series that a lot of institutions have put together, where it's like one event every week, right? And you expect the same set of alumni to join. Obviously, that's going to get pretty, that can lead to fatigue. But I think once you start to think beyond events and like Jay said, like thinking about it from a content distribution perspective, creating good content and distributing it across all of our channels. I think there's going to be less of that fatigue as far as that is concerned, right? So the way I think about this is, we have to go back to first principles here, right? Like every alumni program that we create needs to have a goal or an outcome that you're trying to drive, right? Typically, it's about driving engagement from more alumni. And, let's say there's a mentoring program, right? Like that's not what you would consider an event, but the idea there is to connect alumni to students or alumni to alumni to seek mentorship. And that's a pretty common example of a program that's not actually an event, right? But there's many more ideas that are not very conventional at this point, right? Like, for example, can you bring in one of your alums and do an AMA, right? Like ask me anything, right? Like, can you bring an alum like that to educate everyone around an AMA session? That could be a great alumni program, right? It could be one that a lean alumni office can actually produce, right? For example, could you create affinity-based online groups, right? And facilitate for conversations to happen there, right? Or can you create an online directory for your alumni to connect and network with each other, right? So there's many, many examples of that, programs that have been created. So we just have to look, we don't have to look too far for inspiration, honestly. I mean, there are many, many universities and schools that have created really interesting programs that are great ways to deliver value to alumni beyond events, right? Before I move on, Jay, do you have any other examples of good alumni programs that are not events?
Well, you mentioned Ask Me Anything, AMA. I can't take credit for this at all, but Berkeley did a wonderful Reddit AMA with our beloved chancellor, the head of the university. And that was a lot of fun. It brought a lot of people together. I did share my my cell phone number as a part of that AMA as well, or the chancellor did. I gave her permission to do that, and I got some interesting text messages afterwards. But that's fine because that's what we're here for. We're here to engage with people because no matter who you are, as a graduate of Berkeley, you should feel that you belong. And I think alumni is about belonging. And we talked about centricity. Maybe another way to state that as a strategy is to say that our job is to help every graduate feel like they belong. Yeah. And it is unfortunately true that for many of our alumni, especially Black and Indigenous and people of color who make up our alumni communities, they do not feel welcome. So belonging is the future word. You asked me about my word for 2020 is maybe resilience. Maybe for 2021, let's talk about belonging and how we're really trying to create an alumni community where every graduate feels like they're welcome and that they belong.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I used to refer to that as accessibility, right? Like, how can you make your programs more accessible to everyone? And I think the outcome of that is belonging, right? I think that's a great way to put it. And then I think the last one here is, measuring outcomes, right? I think, we all like to believe we're data driven, but I think we have a long way to go, because especially as programming becomes more multi-channeled and diverse, you'll all be forced to think about measuring outcomes, which is why, we wanted to put this in as a recommendation for 2021, because without that, when you're having all of these diverse programming opportunities, how do you tell what's working and what's not, right? How do you know what to repeat and what not to, right? Because we all know that, with digital marketing in other industries, it's highly data driven, right? They measure everything. I mean, Starbucks very likely knows what your favorite coffee is, right? Based on your order history, probably knows it more accurately than you do yourself, right? Because the next time they want to offer you something, right, they know what you will find most attractive, right? And, imagine, wouldn't it be amazing if you had similar data to inform what your alumni are interested in, right? And I've always found it a little surprising that alumni relations, doesn't rely as much on data. Jay, what's been your observation? Why do you think alumni relations has been behind on this for so long?
That's a great question, Kalyan, and I want to also acknowledge the question from Trevor Froelich. I hope I'm saying that right. We talk about metrics in a staff group that's very relationship oriented. I think it comes down to anecdotes. From the fundraising side of the house, we are constantly hearing anecdotes about how the major donor of today was someone who came to one of our events years ago, who paid for a membership in our alumni association years ago. And through these anecdotes are created very powerful stories about pathways from engagement to philanthropy. And I think far too often, because these stories end in a mega gift, because these stories are told by the fundraising side of the shop, that we begin to map in our head that this pathway is how all alumni would move from engagement over to philanthropy. But of course, that's not true. We need data to tell a powerful story as well. And data should be sourced not just from vendors, accurate information about who alumni are and where they are and what their interests might be, but we need data sourced directly from alumni as well. And I know that folks out here do alumni surveys quite often, and you probably ask questions about how satisfied are you with something, or how likely are you to attend an event, or maybe what's the best date and time for an online event for you. I would suggest that questions like that are not actionable for us. I would much rather see all of us send out an alumni relations survey tomorrow that asks one question and one question only. Overall, how connected do you feel to your alma mater? If we could get alumni to answer that, put it on a scale of 1 to 6, all of a sudden you have an alumni sourced measure of connection. Not a satisfaction or affinity or pride or loyalty. Those are all things that you have. And so you can lose those things. You can lose your loyalty, lose your pride, You can stop feeling an affinity and you can stop feeling satisfied. But when you ask someone about how connected they feel to their alma mater, that's probably a sense that's been created over time. So that's the type of metric that I'm most interested in. Find some way to quantify the level of connection that alumni feel for your institution, and begin to use that not just as a barometer or measure of how things are going with the programs and events and stuff that you hold, but start to look at how those levels of connection actually are correlated with giving. And I think you will provide your development colleagues with some deep insights that they will really value. Because the truth is that there are far many more ideal alumni donors out there than our development teams can manage. The challenge is to identify them efficiently and quickly. And I think alumni relations can do that, but only if we have metrics like something sourced from alumni directly, a level of connection. So this is a particular passion area for me. It's something that I studied and researched in doing my doctorate, and something that I talk about a lot. But I think the most powerful metric for engagement is this concept of alumni identity. And how can our institutions create and cultivate the identities that our graduates have with their alma mater? And ultimately, I think that's the best measure of the success of what we do. So now I'm going to get off my little soapbox here. Thanks for the question. And thank you, Trevor, too. That was a great question in the chat.
Yeah, and I think the important thing from your observation there, Jay, was, it doesn't have to be complicated, right? Like generally when we talk about alumni engagement metrics, it's this, oh, we don't have the people to be able to measure our metrics. We don't have the resources to be able to do it in terms of technology or people. You can actually keep it really simple. And I think that's the important point here, right? Like, I think if you look at, for example, when we started Almabase, we thought we had a very clear idea of what we needed to do and what's going to work. But turns out that none of that was true, right? Like when we started measuring everything that we did and really understood what resonated with our customers, right, is when we really understood what actually worked and what we should continue doing, right? And so it's similar for alumni relations in some sense. Like if you can put together basic measures of how do you define whether a new program that you're doing is successful or not, right? And then just measure that and report on that consistently. I think that's a great start, right? Because if you look at sort of the overall sort of case alumni engagement metrics study, etc., there are various aspects to that, right? But you don't have to start there, right? I think you can start really simple, and I think that's the key thing. Like Jay said, that one question survey could actually go a long way in measuring, how connected alumni feel. And maybe if you did the same survey 6 months from now, after you've implemented some of your strategies, has that changed, right? That's how you measure whether you're actually progressing or not, right? Jay, do you have any other tips on what to measure, what to ignore when it comes to metrics? I mean, one of the things that I've observed, especially in the last few years, is people getting bogged down by too many metrics, right? Like measuring everything around like every single email's open rate and then trying to analyze what that means. But like you can get too inundated in data, but I think it's important to narrow down to what's actually making a difference from an outcome perspective, right? So I'd like to hear your view on that. What should we ignore? What should we measure?
I think we should ignore some of the things that that typically come into what folks call an engagement score. So over the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a real trend in our business to create an engagement score for your institution. But your engagement score is probably just a reflection of data that is already in your database. So you decide you're going to count events and gifts and email opens and clicks, and you aggregate that into a score, let's say. What does that score really tell you? Well, it really just counts things. And one of my great friends from college, a math major, is fond of saying, counting doesn't do anything except prove that something exists. So if you're counting event attendance, virtual or otherwise, what are you really doing? You're just counting that people showed up. What you need is a metric other than some type of amalgamated engagement score, something that shows you if you're moving the needle or not. And I think that's where our industry could improve quite a bit. So many of our metrics are reflective of the past, of data that we've had or held for a long time. we don't have a lot of metrics that can actually tell us whether a new thing or old thing or a new way, an old way of doing business is making a difference. So I think the number one recommendation I have for any outcome, whether that's something homegrown or something from a vendor, is that you want that outcome to be responsive to what you're doing. If the metric that you decide on isn't going to change, whether you do 10 events or 20 events, 100 emails or 10 emails, then it's a bad metric.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think drawing that distinction up front is really important, because there's far too much confusion in terms of like what's really important to measure and then report further in those board meetings, right? Since we're running out of time, I wanted to end with asking Jay one final question, right? So, we spoke about recommendations and resolutions for 2021. If you had to leave the audience with one big recommendation for alumni engagement in 2021, what would that be?
Well, I think we've all heard this term that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think what 2020 has taught us is that consistency eats content for lunch. And back to my earlier comments, we're all trying to create amazing content. The reality is that engagement comes through consistency and consistently delivering our content where alumni are and where their attention is, because attention is the currency of this digital age. And we need to think about consistency as our primary strategy. So please don't sit in a room and beat yourself up about creating the most viral content on Facebook that your institution has ever posted. Instead, think about a structure where you're going to post to Facebook 3 times a week, and you're not going to worry about, is the content the best thing ever, but just that you're going to be there, because consistency is key. Attention is the currency. And that's what I want to leave you with today.
Yeah, I mean, I'll frame this, Jay, and share this on our social media as well. This is, I think, a very good way to sort of describe how consistency is, I think, the most important thing as far as content creation and distribution is concerned, right? So we'll sort of end there. I know there's a couple of questions. I'll leave this slide on if anybody wants to connect with either of us on social media. I know some of you will have to drop off at this point. Thank you so much for joining while we take the rest of the questions here. Jay, if you're still okay with another 10 minutes.
Yes, let's get to as many questions as we can. I saw a great question from my good friend, Ryan Catherwood. What did you stop doing in 2020 and what are you going to start doing in 2021? Ryan, I think that was your question. Or maybe the inverse. What program do you plan to stop doing in 2021? What did you try in 2020 that missed the mark? Man, there's so many things to choose from, and I feel like I can't really provide great examples from Berkeley because I'm only in my first year as executive director. But I think in talking with colleagues across the country, one of the things that was missed in 2020 was tracking. We all pivoted very quickly to doing virtual and online events, but without really the mechanisms in place or the consideration about how to code everyone who participates. And in many cases, just simply to find a place in our database to code that somebody attended a Zoom meeting. So I think that was a missed opportunity in 2020. No doubt we engaged tens of thousands of new alumni across our major institutions in this country, but I have a sense that many of them we don't know about. And as a good marketer once said, if you don't code it, it never happened. So as far as in 2021, what do we plan to stop doing? I don't think we're there yet. Again, I don't think we have enough data to understand, and this whole situation of the pandemic is ebbing and flowing at a rate that makes it really difficult to plan ahead. What I would say, and I'm borrowing this from my good friend Chris Marshall, who's a great consultant in this area, you should have 3 plans going right now. You should have your 60-day plan, you should have your 90-day plan, and you should have your 6-month plan. And even if each of them is on one sheet of paper, but put some thought into how things would change and be ready for that. And I think it'll put you more at ease. Let me see if there's other questions in here.
I think there's one question from Diane. Jay, if you'd like me to read it out. I've proposed a very small. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got it here. Very small alumni fee for all students yearly. Do I feel like, oh, it'll give, okay, so here's a question. Do you feel that a very small alumni fee for students will give them a sense that they have a stake in alumni engagement, or a call to action, so to speak? Drawing on my research background, there are many studies that have looked at the student experience and how that correlates to future engagement or philanthropy. And the qualitative studies in this area share great anecdotes about how the editor of the student newspaper or the president of the student association or people involved, students involved in Greek life are more likely to give and be engaged. That's the qualitative side. Perhaps not surprising. We all have those stories. The quantitative studies that have looked at the direct relationship between the student experience and future philanthropy and engagement have found that there is very little correlation in that space. So I would caution any attitude that students are alumni too. They're not. There's a whole function at your school, college, or university called student affairs that is charged with making the student experience great. Our job is to look out over the alumni who have already graduated and to try and do what we can to re-engage them. That's my personal feeling. Okay, and you can look at the research yourself and you can say, Jay, that's crazy. At our school, student engagement and alumni engagement are one and the same. But I'm just telling you what the data demonstrate. Again, you could do your own search in Google Scholar of student engagement and look for some of these things, but it's just not true that, broadly speaking, students who are engaged or involved in school find their way to being more philanthropic and engaged as alumni. So text me if you disagree and we can talk. Oh, Diana, maybe I missed your question here. Thank you, but not students as alumni, but rather when they become alumni. Oh, I see. Well, just very quickly, I don't think, I have no problem with folks charging alumni a fee for anything. I don't think you should ever discount access. That's what one of my mentors taught me early on in this business. So I think it's completely worth testing. Diane, apologies if I misunderstood your question initially. And Kalyana, probably have time for one more question, and then I'm off to my next Zoom meeting.
So 2020, right? I think we've gone through all of the questions. I don't see any pending questions here. So I think we can call that a wrap. I hope everyone enjoyed that. And I hope all of you have a good holiday season and a much better 2021. Thanks so much, Jay, for doing this.
Thank you, Kalyan, and thank you to Alma Base for hosting this conversation.